What is up? It's your girl back with Killer Cases with the Crystal Pusher, and I would like to talk about this uninhabited home. Now, it's not the nicest, obviously, but it has an insane story attached. Actually, sick. Deplorable behavior. It's in Indianapolis, and it belongs to Leander and his wife, Betty Bradley, who are the grandparents of Ken and Carrie Allen. And Sharon was their mother. She divorced from their father after years of fighting when Ken was 14 and Carrie was 4, and the two just decided to split up their kids. So Sharon kept Carrie and Ken moved to Florida with his father. And living with Sharon on her own, Carrie ended up being very coddled and codependent on her mother. And then Ken had some behavioral issues living with his father in Florida. As Ken grew into adult age, he just constantly got into legal trouble with theft, counterfeit, things like that. He had a severe gambling addiction as well. Now, his grandparents will often bail him out whenever he got into trouble, whether it be sending him money or literally bailing him out of jail. But then he ended up arrested and sentenced to 14 months in prison, and at that time, they decided it was time to cut him off. And he constantly spoke with Carrie and Sharon while he was incarcerated, explaining that he had this big grand idea to make their lives better once he was released from prison. And once he did get released, he went back to Indiana to live with his mother Sharon and his sister Carrie. So when he does get home, he immediately tells Carrie upon the day of his release what his plan was exactly. So the plan actually was to murder his grandparents. He knew they had about $200,000 stored at their home and on top of credit cards and other assets. So he's like, let's take them out. I want mom to help too. And Carrie's like, bet, let's do it. So on December 30th, 2004, Ken approached his mother with his plan, like, hey, let's kill your mom and dad because we can just steal their money and that way we'll have a better life. Sharon's like, no way, I'm not killing my parents. What the hell is wrong with you? And Ken's like, okay, bet. He said, get down or lay down. So he talks to Carrie and he's like, hey, mom actually isn't down like I thought she would be. So unfortunately, she gotta go too. And Carrie's like, okay, bet. So around 9 p.m. that night, Carrie goes into the living room. She turns the TV volume all the way up and then goes into her mother's bedroom where her mother is sleeping. And then Ken follows behind her. He goes and sits on top of their mother and puts a pillow over her face to smother her and then decides to stab her through the pillow multiple times until she was no longer alive. This is literally the tip of the iceberg in this story. Like I haven't even stepped my foot in the water. So please stay tuned for part 2. Part 2. So after the murder, I'm sure they were a little stressed and probably just needed a drink, right? So they go pour up some vodka in the living room, pour up and sip, chill, and vibe, I guess. The most vibing you can do after murdering your mom. After they finish drinking, I'm gonna throw up. Ooh, okay, after they finish drinking, they go back into their mother's bedroom. Yes, they did that. They did that next to their mother's body. Siblings, mind you, they have the same mom and dad. Incest aside, Carrie's 17 and he's 28. Ew. Anyways, but after they're done with that, they decide to wrap their mom's body in the bed sheets and then they take her into the bathtub. So mom's in the tub and they just chill in the house for a couple days, and on January 3rd, Ken decides to call his grandmother over. He tells her that his mom is really sick and he needs her help, so of course she rushes right over. And poor Betty had no idea that when she would arrive, Ken would open a door, and when she walked in, he put a plastic bag over her head and suffocated her while Carrie stood and watched. So then they took her body and placed it in the tub along with their mother's. So now there are 2 bodies to get rid of. So Ken goes and buys a saw and some large garbage bags. And he comes back and dismembers his mother and grandmother and then Carrie backs up during that time. So it's like he cuts, she backs, And they take those parts and they put them out into their rented truck. So now there's 2 down, 1 to go. So they make their way to their grandfather's house. January 5th, 2005, they arrive at their grandfather's house to find him napping. So they wait until he wakes up. 91-year-old man. They wait for him to wake up, and when he walks into the living room, Ken comes from around the corner from the kitchen and hits his grandfather with a hammer in the head and plunges him to death. 91. Your grandpa. So they drag his body to the bathroom too, and then Ken obviously steals the money that he came over for and goes on a 3 to 4 day gambling spree, losing about $60,000. So after blowing through the money, he still has 3 bodies to clean up. So he goes and rents a jackhammer makes a hole in the basement concrete floor where he puts the bodies and then fills that up with wet concrete to cover it all up. Pretty crafty for your first murder, I can't lie. So soon after that, they make a book for it and they head out west. They are pulled over in St. Charles, Missouri, so they didn't get too far from Indianapolis, but the cop who pulls them over for speeding is pretty suspicious about their behavior. I am running out of time once again, so I promise part 3 will be the last one. So even though it was considered a routine traffic stop, the cop was just a little suspicious. He just felt that something was off. He ended up asking both Ken and Carrie for their IDs. Carrie did not have her, and at that point, he ordered them to both exit the vehicle. So he is questioning them both separately about where they're headed, where they're coming from, just the gist of their plans. They're both giving different answers, so he's a little more suspicious. He knows something is up at this point. So he calls for backup and he begins to search the vehicle. Upon his search, he finds the IDs from the grandparents, the credit cards, and some other items that belong to them. And he questioned Ken about that. Ken says, "Oh, my grandparents died and they left me those items." So the cop's like, okay. So he already sent a unit out to the grandparents' residence, but at that time, Carrie ended up blurting everything out anyway and telling them that Ken had killed his mother and grandparents and buried them in the basement of the grandparents' home. So at that point, they were arrested. Units arrived at the Bradley residence, and that is what it looked like at the time of the murders. And they do end up finding the bodies underneath the concrete because they did notice the inconsistency in the basement floor. And during the interrogation, Ken did eventually end up confessing to the murders, basically taking fault for it all, admitting that Carrie was just a bystander, and he really did everything for her to be able to live a better life. And good thing he confessed because Carrie ended up telling her detective every single detail. So they were both arrested and convicted for murder. And considering they heinously killed 3 people, those 3 people being their own family members, they surprisingly avoided the death penalty. Ken was sentenced to life in prison plus 130 years, which I think is petty because just life, okay? He got life. He's not getting out. And Carrie was sentenced to 38 years in her part, but she is eligible for parole in 2024. So just in 2 years, she could get out of prison. It's kind of sick. But that is the story of the Bradley residence. That is what happened in the basement of this home. The home was never resold or listed for sale. Nobody ever moved in after that incident. It's just been abandoned and now boarded up. This is what it looks like today. They should probably burn that motherfucker down for real. What do you think? Leave a comment. If you have a story that you would like me to cover, you can comment that or message me that as well. But thanks for joining.
Everyone loves Eddie Munson from Stranger Things so much, but did you know that he was based on a real person / true crime case? The Duffer Brothers confirmed that Eddie was based off of Damien Echols, one of the West Memphis 3 who were accused of the 1993 murders of 3 8-year-old boys in West Memphis, Arkansas. The bodies of Steve Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore were found in a ditch on May 6, 1993. And not long after, then 18-year-old Damien and 2 of his friends, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin and 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly, were arrested and accused of the murders. They were all metalheads and labeled outcasts, much like Eddie, and the trial heavily focused on Damien's interest in paganism. And the satanic panic at the time was a huge element of the case. Jason and Jesse were sentenced to life in prison, while Damien was sentenced to death by lethal injection. But after new DNA evidence and technology was introduced in 2007, people started questioning whether or not the 3 men were actually guilty. After years of battling, in 2011, a new judge re-examined the case and a new trial was brought, where Damien and the other 2 men entered an Alford plea, which basically meant they were still technically guilty despite maintaining their innocence. The new judge vacated their previous convictions, and they were sentenced to time served, which was 18 years. All 3 of them were then immediately released. After being released from prison, Damien actually lived in Peter Jackson's apartment in New York City. Peter is the director, writer, and producer of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Together, they produced a movie called West of Memphis, which highlights the case. Damien has also published multiple books. The Duffer Brothers said they really wanted to hone in on the satanic panic in Stranger Things 4. Describing the character of Eddie, they said, quote, "What's sad about his narrative is that the people who get to know him really love him, and the people who don't have judged him horribly, just because of the way he dresses and because of his interests." End quote.
This NBA player's murder was finally solved 12 years after his death. 34-year-old NBA player Lorenzen Wright was murdered and his body was found 9 days later in a wooded area in southeast Memphis. On July 19, 2010, Lorenzen's ex-wife Shira lured him to a field by telling him that she was meeting someone there for money. That's when Shira and a man named Billy Ray Turner, whom she hired to murder her ex-husband, ambushed him and shot him multiple times as he ran for his life. As Lorenzen ran, he managed to call 911 and they were able to hear multiple gunshots, which was later played during the trial. There was never a clear motive for his murder, but Lorenzen's mother is convinced that Shira did this for his insurance money. Investigators gave full immunity to Shira's cousin, Jimmy Martin, who was also hired by Shira to participate in Lorenzen's murder, but he actually confessed to the entire thing and told investigators that Shira was the mastermind. It took investigators 7 years to finally arrest Shira and Billy. And in 2019, Billy was sentenced to life in prison, and Shira entered a guilty plea to facilitation of murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison.